many people are just resistant to change in general.
Right.
How are you dealing with that?
Well, I mean, at Microsoft, we have 190,000 people, and I know a lot of the listeners are at large companies. Even at a small company, like, people have different opinions, people have different political beliefs, different upbringings, different values in general. So to try and get something where everyone will agree is impossible. So I think when you use that as a baseline and you know you're not trying to get unanimous support, but rather clarity and understanding of what it is and why the decision was made, and then listening to try and tweak and nuance.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to viewers from all around the world. My name is Frank van den Driest of the Institute for Real Growth, and I'm super pleased to have with me today Letty Cherry, Head of Global Employee and Culture Communications. Welcome, Letty. Let me start by asking you, where are you and how are you?
I'm doing really well. It's great to see you again. I am in Seattle in the United States. So a lovely rainy day.
Lovely rainy day. And how are you doing? In one word.
Grateful.
Grateful. Oh. Great. Well, that's good to hear. That's always a good state of mind, I guess, to be grateful. Well, I'm grateful for you being here. Because I know that the story that you have to share is one that's super interesting and will provide a ton of valuable lessons learned for all the viewers. So you're head of global employee and culture communications at Microsoft. Let's start by, what does the average day of the head of global employee and culture communications at Microsoft look like?
That's the biggest thing I found. There is no average day. Every day is its own unique day with whatever is happening in the world impacting what's going on. There's usually a lot of emails, a lot of meetings, but it's a real mix of looking at data of what employees are saying, figuring out how things are landing, rolling out new changes, posting things on social, reacting to bad and negative feedback of something maybe that's happened in the world, celebrating something good. It's really diverse and mixed and challenging and sometimes frantic, but it's very rewarding work.
It also sounds like an always on job. Like you always need to have the finger on the pulse of things that are happening outside and feedback that people are giving inside the company. Is that correct?
That's correct, and it's always on because it's global in scale. So what the feedback might be happening in Seattle might be vastly different from what we're hearing in different countries around the world at different times. But I also strive really hard for some work-life balance too, and it's good for my perspective and creativity and be able to have impact. So it's finding that balance. Have a great team though.
Well, good for anybody, I would say, that's trying to manage that balance. Indeed. You'll be a better worker for it as well, and a better employee. Letty, I want to talk, and I want to spend this hour talking about the transformation, the culture transformation at Microsoft. Where it all started, when it all started, basically where you were at before COVID struck. Then I will zoom in on, well, we can't say, obviously, we're post-COVID, but we've hopefully gone through the worst of it in most parts of the world. And I want to take a sneak peek into the future and the plans that you and the team are having. As a red thread to the conversation, does that work for you?
That sounds perfect, yes.
Great, good. Well, let's start at the very start. What was the moment that this transformation, that you first heard of it?
I'd say that at the very beginning of when I really started to see the shift, I know there were years of work to make it happen, but when Satya Nadella came on as CEO of the company, there were a lot of changes within the senior leadership team, and that team and our HR team really partnered together to figure out how do we shift the culture of the company. And really taking it from this know-it-all culture. For anyone of you who've worked with Microsoft in the past, a lot of really smart people, but you'd sit in meetings and it would be that feeling of who's the smartest person in the room, who has the greatest idea, who can showcase that insight in the best way, in the loudest way. And it really started to evolve to that growth mindset. And how do we be thoughtful? How do we talk about our mistakes and not knowing everything? How do we learn from others, regardless of what level people are at in the company? How do we start with questions in mind and really active listening and just try and change a lot of the behaviors that we had so that we could excel and get into the future in a different way? And so thankful. It's changed so dramatically. So at that very beginning, it took some time, but the company changed its mission, its culture, and there was a lot of work over a number of years. It's still ongoing. It's a never-ending journey, but to really shift that culture.
But so, I mean, was it, let's say, announced as we're now entering a transformation? Did the journey get a name, for example? Like how did you hear about it, or how were people first told about it?
Satya came out at our employee town halls. There were employee emails that went out from him, as well as Kathleen Hogan and our senior leadership team. Kathleen's our chief people officer. And those announcements were made of what is our mission? Why are we changing our culture? How are we thinking about unifying the teams in the org? It was all happening at once. And it was a repetition. It wasn't a one-time thing. It's like, okay, we've communicated, we're out and we're done. It was ongoing for years. It's still ongoing, but different parts of it are repeated. But that first moment that I first recognized it was at that initial town hall for the company, where it was like, okay, here is what it is. This is what it stands for. But then there were training sessions. There were emails distilling down. There were videos to watch, because it's complicated and it's not just one thing. There are so many facets to how it comes to life.
And so it really started with the announcement of a new mission. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And
a new mission, and everything just trickled down from there.
And so what was, or maybe still is, that mission?
So the mission is great because it's listed, it's on our employee badges, it's everywhere within the company. And so it's really about how we empower every person in every organization on the planet to achieve more. And there's a lot of emphasis on every person. We think through that a lot because that makes us challenge ourselves to say, okay, well, how are we adding accessibility into our products? Because if we really want to think of every person, it means regardless of geography, ability, location, socioeconomic wealth, where there's broadband, there's so many components that fall into it. So if we can aspire to try and empower everybody, that was the mission. And that was a change.
And so the mission was announced. And indeed, you can imagine, this is called the Humanised Growth Series, which is indeed about long-term value creation to all stakeholders and the people behind all these stakeholders groups. So that clearly resonates with the mission. Lovely, indeed, beautiful and super, I think bold and also it gives a lot of direction is my immediate sense when hearing it for the first time. But so that mission was announced, and then the culture. Was that culture described like in a set of words, or was it more mood boards, or was it sentences? How did you first hear in that town hall about the culture?
Yes to all of the above. In the first way, it's Microsoft, so we do a lot on PowerPoint slides. So there were definitely the PowerPoint slides with the key words that make it up, then the descriptions of what it means. There were mood boards. There were also a lot of videos. There were training materials for managers that we rolled out as well. Because we wanted to show scenarios of what it means and what each word means, what each concept means. And it was in every meeting room that we have, there would be things of what it was and what it's become, so that you could really think through your actions in a meeting. So if you're thinking of thinking what you could learn from what happened, as opposed to trying to find the fault in something. Yeah. If you could think about asking the questions in a different way, of listening before speaking. It had little key words to keep continuing to remind us, because it's a lot as you look through change management for that shift. So there was artwork around the campus. We had we do a lot of window clings around different campuses where big visuals. So it was All of the above.
And so that set of values, because if I compare, for example, I've been in many places at Mars offices, and there's always the values. Wherever you come, you will always see those values, and they're very, very central to how that company is run. Sounds very similar in that sense to Microsoft. But has your set of values changed since then? And when was that start, by the way?
I would say we had our values and our values were present, but it was much more the push for the culture at first. We had a lot of values. So once we were a few years into the culture shift, I would say it gave people permission to come forward, to speak out, to share what wasn't working, what they didn't feel comfortable with. And during that time frame was really when it was a push to say, okay, you know what, we actually need to also put more light onto our values. We had a lot of them. So really picking what are the top few, making them really clear, having leader-led discussions with each of the individual teams of what those values actually meant to them, examples of maybe how they didn't live those values at all times and how they've learned from it, how they think it's important at this point in time, so they could have really honest conversations with their teams, because it's a learning journey and it isn't the expectation that suddenly everyone's perfect and adapts to the values, because those values are really, really important.
Yeah, it's funny. We had a session in one of our leadership programs, actually yesterday, a session about values and asking people a list of 30 values to divide them in important, more important, and most important, equally, 10, 10, 10, and then choose the top 3 out of those most important, and then discuss them with each other. And all of a sudden, we found out very quickly that people had very different understandings and associations and connotations with each of those words on a piece of paper. But it started with everybody saying that they were extremely important to them, values. And all of a sudden I realized, like, we spend so little time, even like with our children or families, discussing values and what they are. And I was wondering, when you were going through that process in Microsoft, discussing them, did you also look at how did they match the individual, your personal values? So the Microsoft values versus your personal one.
Yes, in those conversations with the individual teams, it's hard when you have, as many employees as we have to have like really meaningful individual conversations at scale like that. So to have it within each individual organization, those conversations definitely occurred to say, okay, like, what's important to you in your life? What's important to you at work? And what are the values that really mean something to you together, and stack ranking them as well. And then people would have small group conversations about that. So it's definitely, you're so right, even in terms of how people interpret similar words. You would think, okay, well, if I say respect means the same thing to you and to me, to everyone. But once you break it down, it's really how it comes to life is very, very different. So even having those conversations, whether it was for their home life or their work life, or in this day and age, like those two are so mixed as well. Seeing those nuances and having those discussions have been really interesting as well.
Yeah, there was also something that you mentioned a little bit earlier about you were inviting people to give feedback, right? It feels a bit like, that's also opening Pandora's box, right? Because if you invite people, they might actually tell you what they don't like as well. What was your experience there?
It's definitely a part of that culture journey, is that addition to listening. It's one thing to talk at people, but if you don't listen to the feedback, people just harbor. It's not like those feelings aren't there. The feelings are there, and they usually get worse if people don't have an opportunity to have a conversation about it, to express it. But what we found is that people bring out their perspective in different ways. There's some people, like we have Yammer, which is an internal social media site, and there's some people have no qualms about saying anything and everything about how they feel about something to the entire company on there. And there's some people, like, you could give them an anonymous survey and they're still really worried about sharing how they really feel. Yeah. So trying to give a number of avenues to let people vocalize their perspective in a way that feels safe to them, that feels authentic to them. So that we're not just listening to maybe the louder voices that might be a minority, or they might be the majority, and ignoring maybe some really meaningful feedback. So trying to have different types of surveys, different manager-led conversations, peer conversations, just to try and understand what's resonating, what's not, how do we adapt, how do we change?
Yeah, what I hear a lot of also CMOs in our leadership programs is say, well, so we have these intentions, but then there's the naysayers, the people that whatever we try, whatever channel we offer them, or whatever stimulus or support we offer them, they just don't. Many people are just resistant to change in general.
Right.
How are you dealing with that?
I mean, at Microsoft, we have 190,000 people, and I know a lot of the listeners are at large companies. Even at a small company, like, people have different opinions, people have different political beliefs, different upbringings, different values in general. So to try and get something where everyone will agree is impossible. So I think when you use that as a baseline and you're not trying to get unanimous support, but rather clarity and understanding of what it is and why the decision was made, and then listening to try and tweak and nuance it. So when we went in with more of that perspective, it's helped. Also to have really strong principles of why we make the decisions, how we make the decisions, and communicating that has helped as well. Because then people may not agree with it and they'll share their perspective, but at least they understand what it is, why the decision was made, if it's going to change or not. There's some things like, this is a decision, this is how it's going to be. And there's other things like, wow, we hadn't thought of that. We've learned, thank you for all the feedback, and here's how we've adapted it. So as long as we're clear and transparent and understand that not everyone will love something, it's trying to find, like, when you're at that tipping point, though, when it's like, okay, you know what, 5-10% of people are really upset about this, but there's been overwhelming happiness about it from the rest, versus, oh, it's really mixed. Like, we have really high volume of discontent. Maybe we really should look at that.
Can you give an example of where you came with an idea that thought was great, but then you got so much pushback that you, redirected the course?
Well, this one isn't specific to values, but I can give an example. Like, even just from early on during the pandemic, when a lot of the schools started to close, and suddenly we had parents who are at that pivotal decision to say, okay, does someone have to leave the workforce? How do we have teaching our children, or them with no childcare while trying to work? And so we had rolled out a childcare leave. So there was an option for people to take full part-time leave during that time to take care of their kids and then come back to work. But during that, we had heard, oh, wait, there's all these other people maybe don't have children, but they also have sick relatives, and there's, no hospital or healthcare facilities or other things, and they need to do caregiving for others. So how do we extend it out beyond just school-aged children to a larger subset? And there was a large focal group. It's like, oh, we hadn't thought of that. That's really good feedback, and we could add it on.
Listening to 190,000 people, that's humongous. So you need to be, systemic in the approach, because otherwise you'll drown, right? In all the feedback you're getting. Can you tell a little bit about the system you've built, the listening system you've built?
So we have several across the company in general. Like, we have an HR team that does a ton of listening. They do a regular annual, it's actually multiple times a year, of like a full company survey that they have really good traction for the feedback from that. So that gives more, I would say, a mass scale pulse of what's happening quarterly, throughout the year, or biannually. There's also a daily survey that goes to a subset of the company. It's a random sample size every single day that goes out with a series of questions. And that one has more impact to have open-ended questions or to add in things that you might want to know about. We also watch what's happening in the world. So looking at media and social coverage to understanding what's happening geopolitically, what's happening at scale that's trending, because what happens outside the company now comes in. So if there is an attack against a specific race or ethnicity, and we don't respond to that, it's a bit short-sighted. If something really bad has happened, if one of the things were happening, with the war in Ukraine, like that isn't just like, oh, well, that's happening and we're going to do our day job. That impacts millions of people around the world of like, how do you work when that is happening to their friends and relatives and families and others? So trying to understand what's happening around the world. We have systems as well where leaders have their own communications people as well. So as topics are bubbling up within individual teams and individual organizations, that gets funneled through as well. There's a social media where people post to it. There's anonymous forums that are external that are there as well that people can post to. So there's so many different mechanisms. We haven't perfected it. There's no way to listen and understand what 190,000 people want, but at least it gives us signals to dig into, to say, okay, hey, we're seeing this trending. Let's go look for more information on this topic. Are people hearing anything? Because that then sends us in the direction to say, hey, you know what? There's something happening, and people are concerned about sustainability. And there's maybe there were protests happening about it, and there's a forum that's happening externally, and we're announcing something, and we're seeing chatter internally. All those signals collectively help us to know, okay, let's dig in.
And so what's the let's say percentage, if you split 100% between what you're listening, the quantitative listening, where you're just reporting back numbers and indexes and benchmarks, etc., versus the qualitative, where you really, like you mentioned, open-ended questions, maybe even in-person conversations. How do you balance those two?
It's definitely both. So I would say for the bigger things, the quantitative help us really say, okay, there's a systemic issue of something really good or really bad that's happening. And the qualitative helps us fill in to say, these are the specific types of questions we're getting. These are the concerns that have been elevated or raised, because the numbers will say, pay attention, but the qualitative really helps us understand, pay attention to what and how.
Have you also had the other way around, where you picked up qualitative signals without actually noticing, major shifts in the barometer, the quantitative barometer?
Yes, that's definitely happened, where we'll have maybe 2 or 3 teams that will come forward and say their communications lead would come forward and say, hey, in my organization, and these could be organizations of 200 and 50,000, it's anywhere in between. But if someone's coming forward and saying, in my organization, we just had maybe an Ask Me Anything session, and this question came up 3 times, like, that's interesting. And then if you get another team and it came up, like, that's happened. And then we try and figure out, it's like, oh, okay, there's something going on here. And then we pull, or we send out, put it in the daily survey, or we filter the data in a different way, because we get so much data. And then we can surface a bit of a trend. And sometimes you're right, the numbers and the volume might be low, but the impact or the importance of it is high, especially when it's something related either to our business and something that we do, or related to the makeup of the individuals on the team.
So your role is, I get it. I mean, if you build a system, you need somebody to coordinate, to support, etc., and to think how you built the system in the first place. Mm-hmm. But in the end of the day, culture change. Yes, obviously it's Satya came on board, and that ignited it, and his vision will have huge power. But in the end of the day, my idea, especially 190,000 people, it can't be just led from the top. It needs to be carried and supported and driven at all levels.
Yes.
What is your experience there? And like, just looking from your role, which is a central role, and working with all these different people that you need to make a change like this happen.
I think that was a key learning along the journey of culture change. As we started to go through it, it was very much top down and explaining of what it was. Yeah. But when it comes to practice and bringing it to life, it's harder at that small level. Like, what is the individual manager of maybe 3, 5, or 10 people? How are they bringing that to life? And it wasn't happening at that level necessarily. And I think there was a recognition, and a great recognition from our HR team, to say, hey, you know what? We have this amazing, talented group of managers, but a lot of them have been made managers because they're really good at their job. They're innovative, they can build great products, they've delivered, they have ROI for the company. It wasn't about, hey, they have great EQ, they're great at training and listening and coaching, and maybe the right training mechanisms weren't in place. So they had actually put in like a mandatory 40 plus hours for the year training for every single manager within the company, and really digging deep in those manager skills, how to be more inclusive, how to understand our culture, how to live our leadership principles. Like there were really good, tangible coaching skills that could be brought to life. And it was based on different levels of the company. Like if you're a brand new manager versus a seasoned manager that's leading massive teams and many years of experience, it's a different experience that you would get. But I think that understanding is to be able to bring it to life within the company, you need to engage the managers. And so for me in my role, that's helped tremendously, because now we have this community of managers that we can speak to at any point to share, to say, okay, here are the things you really should know or should bring to life with your teams, not just on this big moment of training, but on a regular basis, because the culture changes and the world changes. And if we're noticing things that maybe aren't landing the right way, or people need to understand, or something new we want to communicate, there's now this audience that can live it at all levels of the company. It's not just, okay, yeah, I get, Sati, you said that, but you're many levels above me. I've never, I'm not seeing you on my day-to-day basis, but my manager's telling me something different, versus trying to get more symmetry at all levels of the company.
What was the most important intervention to get indeed all these different levels of managers actually engaged?
I would say that first of all, the recognition that is such an important audience, the training, and then having the tools to be able to communicate directly to the managers. I think I wouldn't say it's just one of them, but that training first and foremost. I think that our HR team did a tremendous job of creating that, just bringing people up to recognize, like, wow, you shouldn't just give someone a promotion because they're doing a great job. Like when we changed our culture, we also changed our reward system so that it wasn't just how great are you contributing as an individual, but how are you setting your team up for success? How are you contributing to others? How are you leveraging their work? But the managers have to realize that and apply that. And so to really enforce all of the things and part of the change with the managers so that they learned it, they understood it, they see the importance, then you can reinforce it in a great way. And they're part of the solution and part of the change.
That's one of the things that really, I don't know, resonated with me. The whole idea how you changed, let's say, the incentives from, the example I always give that I read somewhere is, how much Microsoft product did you sell, to shifting that to how much did your client or whoever you interact with, how much did that person or that organization grow, and that defines your incentive. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, and that all ladders again back to the mission. Yeah. So it's not just then like a meaningless tagline for people. It's like, how are you empowering others? How are you, and then others, whether it's customers or partners, the communities where we live and work, it's all of those things become top of mind.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and indeed very, very at the core of what I would call humanized growth. Indeed, fantastic. Hey, so you were on the way for quite a few years, and then the world stood still. COVID hit, and everything changed. Tell me, what happened? What was the immediate impact, and what was the more, let's say, longer term impact?
It definitely, like everywhere around the world, the impact was huge. Where I feel like maybe I was grateful we were where we were on our culture journey is we had a set of principles already in place. Like we understood that the safety of our employees was first and foremost. It wasn't, okay, how do we keep going? How do we not lose too much money during this time? But how do we keep our employees safe? How do we keep our customers up and running? Especially knowing a lot of the customers are hospitals, first responders, people who are creating any of like the supply chain that's needed to keep the world running. Like, how do we not have that come to a grinding halt where we're able to, and how do we help the communities? And by having that mindset and that spirit of growth mindset, like, we don't know anything. Most people have not experienced anything like that. There's no playbook we can pull out. So how do we use the ability to sit and listen and learn and use our principles to create everything that we have? So as we started to look at the data and shut down operations and have like in-person operations and have everyone really move remote, that could, other than our essential workers, that was that real shift in time. And from there, it was unbelievable how engaged everybody at the company was to try and solve. How do we continue? How do we keep going? Like, the hours of time on a daily basis that Satya and the senior leadership team and us sat there coming up with, like, what is our response? How do we engage? How do we do basic things? Like, how do we convert all the food that's in our cafeterias that we normally serve over to schools that are supposed to have hot lunch programs where the kids now are at home and don't have food? How do you do that? Like, so hard.
And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely, let's say, the biggest common denominator, I'd say, in companies that reacted strongly and in a great way to what happened was the extent to which they were clear on their purpose or vision, whatever you want to call it, because that gave direction to, basically a litmus test to what to do and what not to do, which I also clearly hear you say. So that helped you get through that first wave. Then fast forward a little bit. What changed? What do you sense has changed permanently as a result of COVID?
I think everything's changed in the workforce. I think it was hard for everybody at first. It's like, how can you be at home or people even have conducive spaces to work? And then I think there was this level of just, we're human, we adapt to the circumstance. And after a couple of years, okay, this is normal. And I think people who at first were like, I can't work not in my office, not with people every day. There's going to be no productivity. There's going to be nothing. And it was a difficult adjustment. Then they adapted, and then there was productivity, and people learned to actually do things that maybe were more inclusive than when they were in the office, because everyone's at parity, because every single person, regardless of geography, is on a video conference call, as an example, say if you're on that type of work. But that created that level of inclusion and expectation that it wasn't like, if you're like, we used to have meetings and we'd sit around the table and we'd have discussions and we'd have people on Teams, and there'd be oftentimes at the end, oh yeah, is there anyone on the phone or anyone on Teams that has a question? As opposed to now, it's like everyone's on Team and people are putting things in the chat and everyone's involved. So I think those are the things that will hopefully continue. The expectations that there will be more parity, there'll be more expectation for everybody to be treated as equals regardless of geography. I mean, we've all seen with workers, like more and more people don't necessarily want to be set to a certain locale. A lot of people really want flexibility. So flexibility to have the benefits of coming into an office space and seeing human beings, not just on the screen, having that social engagement and social interaction, but also having the flexibility to not deal with commuting and traffic, and maybe having quiet time to just think and be creative or get work done. So to give that flex, I think is going to be really, really important. I think it's given people time to think about like what's really important to them, what's purposeful, what are the things maybe they did in their job that were time wastes, and like how do they really focus on the more meaningful, more important things. And hopefully it's taught people as well of just the importance of caring about the greater good and not just, again, bottom line for things, but really how do we as a world, it's something like, this is a time where we've never seen it. It's not just, oh, my country or my location or my people, it's the world. And how do we think more globally about things and situations and adapt to them?
Yeah, definitely. Just going back to the maybe a bit more practical side of indeed people now returning in most places around the world, returning to their offices. I read an HBR article where it said that actually now not returning to the office might hurt your career progression because you miss out on the conversations at the coffee corner. You're less visible, during the day. Do you recognize it? And if so, how do you manage that?
And I think that's one of the biggest opportunities for everyone right now is to figure out how do you adapt your culture, like as we've had our culture journey, how do you adapt your culture to all of those new scenarios that are brought up there? Because it hasn't been long enough, unless you're in certain countries like China who've been more open for longer, maybe up until recently, but there are certain countries that have been open longer who probably have learnings that we can all share from. And then there are a number of countries where things still aren't fully open, or that people are just starting to get back and are still in that learning and adapting phase. So I think there's going to be a number of things that we need to pay attention to. How do we take those key learnings when it was 100% virtual and bring them to life in a different way when people are in the office? How do you, I'll give you an example, like how do you remember that everyone that goes into a meeting brings their laptop and turns on their video? So it's not just reliant on maybe the little camera in the front, but everybody, again, is parity. They have their own box. Is that parity? And doing those little things, starting the meeting when people are having the in-person banter and chit-chat and catching up at the beginning of a meeting, and then you start the real meeting and let everyone else join in, versus starting as soon as you get in the room so everyone can be part of the conversation. So I think it's trying to take maybe some of the best practices so we don't default back to some of those old bad behaviors that we had.
Yeah, and listen, we talked a lot about COVID. You mentioned war in Europe. There's climate crisis. As head of employee communications, which is a very internal, this is all external. What do you see changing in the role of companies, and Microsoft specifically, with how they let's say where politics and business come together? For example, do you leave or don't you leave Russia as a business? Mm-hmm. Big topic. So politics and business, to what extent is that a discussion that you as head of employee communications are involved in, and what do you see happening?
Well, I would say first off, and the reason we call it employee versus internal communications is I would say an equal amount of my job is externally facing as it is internal, more because employees don't just come to work anymore and do their day job and be done, but they're busy on social. And like you said, when something terrible is going on in the world, whether it's a small scale thing or a global situation, like that comes into the workplace. People expect big companies now not to just sit on the sidelines and say, okay, now I'm going to focus on my day job, which is work. What happened? You tell people you want them to bring their authentic selves to work. That comes with who they are and all the external influences that come with that. So we're finding a tremendous amount of time is focused on exactly what you said, like what is happening around the world, sustainability, war in Ukraine, and many other situations that are happening. Those have massive impact and decisions that you have to make to say, okay, what is our company position on it? What can we do that makes sense to who we are to make change or not? Because there are too many situations for anyone at any company to jump in on everything. So to recognize, like, where can we have the most impact? Where are we involved? Where do we make a political stance or not? Where is it the right way, the wrong way?
How do you decide that? And let's say, because it can't all be Satya or the head of HR deciding on which political issue or global issue you do get involved in and you do take a stance versus where you don't.
So definitely our principles come, but I think when you have strong principles, that helps.
Yeah.
This is probably one of the harder problems we've had to figure out, because a lot of things could fall in and you could spend literally the whole time for the entire company to try and solve all of them and still not do it. So to try and find the right ones. So the principles help. is it impacting our customer base? Is it impacting our employees? Is it something where we can make a difference? Like if there is a situation that's happening and while it feels really terrible, our business has nothing to do with it and we really can't make an impact, that might not be one where we get involved. Versus sustainability is an easy and obvious one. It's a global issue. It's an area where we're heavily involved, and it's an area that we decided, okay, this is an area we want to prioritize. We have commitments, and there's actually tangible things that make sense where we can make an actual difference. Those will do, versus maybe a situation happens in a country where we don't have any employees that are there, or we don't have any infrastructure. It might be one where, wow, that's terrible that's happening, but we can't get involved, versus others. But it's very, very hard. There's also a number of things where we do stuff behind the scenes. There's times where it actually could put our customers or our employees in harm's way if people knew we might be working on something and working with those governments or on those things. But if you make a media splash, our employees could be targeted because of it. So we have to be very careful as well to understand, not just maybe putting my US lens on it, or I'm Canadian, maybe it's my Canadian lens on it, versus really understanding the nuances of that country and the political situation there. So
isn't that very difficult if you say, empowering others, and let's start with your own employees. Mm-hmm. And some employees might have a very different political stance versus others, and you want to empower them to do what they think is right, might be very different. How do you manage these kind of tensions in the workforce?
That's also very hard. The political side is probably one of the hardest ones.
Yeah. Because
you're right, there are people with different beliefs, and some would say that if someone said something, it might be their political belief, but does that map to the value of the company? And how do you bring those two together? Yeah. And if you have an employee resource group that believes strongly in something, and maybe there's a political belief or religious belief of somebody else, and those don't map, it's very difficult. So we try to at least bring our values into play at that point. Have your discussions, have your beliefs, have your choice to contribute where you want to contribute. Like for our donations, people can donate where they want and we'll match, versus saying where it'll go. People can have their say, but live our values, be respectful, have integrity, have accountability, like know that you are a representative of this company when you're saying these things on social. At least you can live those values, that will help people understand that the differences of people are important. The reason we want more diversity, whether it's racial, ethnicity, socioeconomic, geographic diversity, is important, because you then get these different mindsets, perspectives that map what our customers have, which help better the company and our ideas. But you have to do it respectfully, and I think that is the key component for it.
So it is basically what you're saying. It is mission and values first, and it's mission and values last. That's where it all starts and begins.
And culture, I would say. That growth mindset culture for us is like hands down too.
Yeah, very related to the values, I guess. So with that in mind, most of our viewers are marketers and marketing leaders, growth leaders. What is the role that marketing can, and in your mind, should play in this culture and values discussion?
I think, first of all, marketers have one of the most important roles of how do you bring something to life at massive scale. So as they're thinking through things, whether it's going to the employee base or whether it's going externally, how are you representing? Like, do you understand the broad group that you're marketing to? Do you understand what's happening politically in that area? Some of the sensitivities that are happening in an area. Do you care what things are the most important? What does your company stand in terms of diversity and equity and inclusion? And is that reflected in your marketing in the right way? Like if you talk about all of the things that you care about, from your values to diversity to anything else, is that reflected in the marketing that you do? Because I know from my standpoint, like where we make mistakes all the time, and it's not intentional, but a lot of the times it's, oh, wow, we put this beautiful thing together and guess what? It's not accessible. And so we've just left out a whole big community, or we didn't reflect a certain community in the right light because we didn't even have anybody of that community working on it, looking at it. We used our own assumptions. So trying to use those values and beliefs for anything we do within marketing, I think is integral.
And so maybe very difficult questions, but so many of the participants in our program work at companies that don't have values and culture change so central in the decision making. The resources that Microsoft is putting behind it also, I think, are pretty massive by what you're telling. So if you don't have all that, where do you start? What guidance would you give people that don't have the old organization working along with them?
I totally get that. I think it's important to start at the top. If there isn't an understanding from the CEO, from the senior leadership team of the importance of it, it's not going to be rolled out in the right way. So I think that's the first thing, because it definitely, you can do it at different, I've been at different companies, small and large, and you can do it at different scales. Coming up with that mission and values is really important. How you roll it out can be done over time. It can be done in simple ways. It can just be constant email reminders. Like, it doesn't need to be big, splashy, even internal campaigns that go with it. But spending the time with the experts who've done the work and testing it and testing it and testing it to at least come up with those things, it will help. It's better than picking up the pieces afterwards. Like, at least the trends that I'm noticing, employees around the world are speaking up more and more. They have principles that they're standing by, expectations from their employers that are different than they've been in the past, expectations for employers to be involved in things that are not just work related, and to understand them and to get the right talent, to retain the right talent. Those things are really, really important. So at least to prioritize the work to come up with them and to communicate them out, even in the most basic form, is really important.
Could you make a business case for this?
100% you can make a business case. I mean, just the cost of trying to hire a new employee at this point and getting that right talent. Like, if you can put a dollar value of what it costs per employee that you lose, is one thing. The cost of acquisition of talent is huge as well. And it's a hard to get key talent right now. It's very, very competitive. So it's going to be hard. So I think that's one way to do it. There's also if you're a public company and you have bad situations that go public. I mean, I'm not going to name companies because I don't want to put anyone on the bus, but I would say from our standpoint, we've been there. We've had something where an employee will speak out about a time that we didn't live our values the way that we'd hoped to, or didn't live our culture the way we'd hoped to. That is reputation damage. We've had, you can have customers that don't want to work with you because I don't want to work with a company that doesn't have those values. It can affect your stock price. There's a major brand impact. So if you're not proactive about it and you want to think of the cost of damage control, it's big.
Yeah, and then there's always what I would call the shower time. But if people are really engaged, they'll be also thinking outside working hours, whether that's in the small room or under the shower. They'll be thinking about, because it's just more about things that involve their jobs, even if it's outside work hours. And it's that kind of energy and dedications that you can't buy with a higher salary or something.
It's so true. And I will say, like, regardless of having all of that, it definitely, I'm not here saying that, oh yeah, we've cracked the nut and it's perfect. Like, it's hard and it's ongoing, and it doesn't mean that you have it, that nothing else happens. It actually, there's a point when you improve your culture and you have the values that it may actually get harder for a while, because you're now, maybe people were scared to speak out before and have had years of maybe mistreatment or not done as good as they had. And once your culture improves and they actually feel safe and secure and you might do something about it and you're listening, you have more people who might speak out and come forward and talk about it too. So I also want to prepare people to think through that too. That's not like, oh, I've got my values, my mission, and smooth sailing, everything's going to be great. It's an ongoing journey and it goes like this. And yeah, I don't know anyone who's 100% solved. I don't think there's a way to, but at least you can make improvement.
Hey, and so, okay, so looking at where you are and then looking into the future, what's one thing that you would really wish for in terms of the journey that you're on?
Oh, it's a great question. I wish for a crystal ball to know what's coming next would be lovely. But in reality, like, I definitely hope that through like these last couple of years have been really, really hard. And it's not like, okay, people are back and suddenly all the scars from the past 2 years are gone. And there's still ongoing situations. People have had tremendous loss. How can we be more empathetic as human beings and bring that into the workplace? How can we be more understanding at all levels of the company of just what is happening and how we can work together as society? And how do we take some of the key learnings for inclusion that we've had when it was all virtual and bring it to this new culture to make it a better culture that understands flexibility in a new way, that it's not just I'm chained to my desk and it's these set hours and I have to be here versus, okay, I'm going to go take my kid to the doctor and then I'm going to come back and they're going to be an activity later and I'm going to work late in the evening. Like it works for me in my schedule versus others. So I have that, but I hope that lasts for others.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, it makes me think what you say about, some of the gains we made during COVID and we risk, losing that a little bit if we're not really on top of it. And I don't want to, I know it's not about revealing all your internal scores because they're yours and you don't need to share them. But by and large, can you say anything about, let's say, employee engagement during COVID and then when COVID is slowly fading out? Is there a correlation with what's happening with COVID and the engagement scores that you're seeing?
I would say that the engagement changed from a score perspective. I think it's more from a tactic perspective. It's how the engagement happened. It was less big in-person meetings. It was less traveling all over the world to different things. It was more virtual. And so there were pros and cons.
I meant it to be more, let's say, your barometer of the extent to which people were happy in that.
Yeah, no, I think it was pretty equal. Like, I don't think the barometer has changed. Okay. I just think the how around it has changed. But the barometer, I don't feel like the scores have truly changed from it. We just learned along, like there were blips where we learned along the journey. It's like, okay, we need to do more, but it has to be in a virtual versus now, okay, how do you do it in a hybrid component? Okay. I will say for people like just as marketers, like you need to budget for this new hybrid world as well, because before it used to be just in person or the staging and production of a hybrid thing or of a virtual thing. And now when you need to do both at the same time, there's cost to it.
Yeah. Well, that's, yeah, I totally agree. And I think we all get a sense that indeed what you're doing really requires resources. Letty, this has been a great conversation. Before we go, is there any message any call to action that you would like to share with the audience?
I would definitely say it's a call to action for the future. Like, I think we're all going to be on a shared learning journey of what does this new culture look like? What does the new workforce look like? How do we continue to remember the learnings we've had for now, and how do we adapt? Because I don't think it's going back to where it was, and I don't think it's anywhere in between, but how do we share and learn and figure out what this new workforce and culture looks like?
Well, I mean, I can only say you've been very generously sharing your learnings, and me and many with me are very fascinated by the incredible transformation that Microsoft had gone through and the impact it's making. So I really, really want to thank you for that. To the viewers, I want to also thank you for being with us for this hour. And I want to announce that on May 6th, in 2 weeks, we'll have John Rapogel. John Rapogel, former CEO of 7th Generation, of Birds Bees, and who's now what I would call a humanized growth investor. We'll sit down with my co-founder, Mark the Swan Aarons, and that will undoubtedly be a fascinating conversation as well. So with that, thank you everybody. Thank you, Letty, and see you soon. Bye-bye.